most of the people who watch this podcast will know, and in fact, I believe Andy was my first guest back in the early days of DarkHorse. Andy is a local independent journalist who has been absolutely dogged about revealing what is taking place on the streets of Portland when the mainstream news was absolutely pretending that it wasn't happening. So throughout the rioting, Andy was there, and he was one of the few places you could go to figure out what was occurring in the streets of Portland.
He's got a bias. He's got a slant. He's unapologetically conservative, and he sees nothing to recommend what Antifa are doing. And it's unlikely if they started doing things that were recommendable that he would be the first to notice. But you know what his bias is, and he doesn't hide it.
Well, there's more to say here.
Sure.
I think I would say Douglas Murray has a bias, but he navigates it in a way that never troubles me, or at least not that I've seen. Andy is not the same. There's some places where Andy has done some things that make me recoil a bit. On the other hand, I would point out that Andy is in a very vulnerable position. He's on the ground here in Portland, where he is absolutely loathed by his subject, right? As he is looking at the violence on the streets of Portland, they are out to get him. His murder is being called for in graffiti around downtown. It's really a very difficult situation. At the same time, he is bootstrapping a method of feeding himself. In other words, there is no niche for the independent journalist on the ground reporting on a mob that hates him and wants him dead, but he's doing it. And so while on the one hand, I think it is important, to figure out how to keep one's biases out of one's reporting, and I want Andy to do that. I also recognize that he has been able to do what nobody else is able to do, which is to report this story on the ground consistently in spite of tremendous danger to him and his family. And so anyway, I'm rooting for him to find a model that allows him to, we all have our biases, but if you're a reporter, you got to keep them out of your reporting. Nonetheless, Andy has been reporting this story. He has a book coming out. I believe the title is Unmasked.
Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy.
Which sounds like absolute hyperbole until you talk to some Antifa folks and you discover that actually they'll tell you that they're more or less, they burn flags repeatedly in front of the courthouse here and all that.
And on Inauguration Day, they had another protest saying, I think, fuck Biden. They're no more interested in peace now than they were during the Trump era.
Right. And the alignment, people should go back to my discussion with Jeremy Lee Quinn to get there is an ancestral relationship between Antifa and anti-racism, which I didn't know. But nonetheless, the confluence of BLM and Antifa is more or less accidental. And they have now more or less parted company in Portland for, reasons that are easily understood. But in any case, so Andy has the book coming out.
In like April, I think, something. Oh, February. I don't know. So.
And wouldn't you know it, Antifa, let's go back to the Inauguration Day riots. The Inauguration Day riots here in Portland were actually an attack on the Democratic Party headquarters locally. Not symbolic. They broke windows, clearly the same violence we see from them routinely. And there were banners in front that said, "We are ungovernable," right? They are declaring the equivalent of war on the structures that allow us to function as a society. They are anarchist, even though they claim when we say things like that we don't know what we're talking about. But no, by the self-definition of anarchist, they meet it.
Right. And declaring yourself ungovernable makes the subtitle here, Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy, makes sense.
Yep, makes sense.
Yep.
So in any case, very important that a guy like Andy with firsthand knowledge of this has a book coming out. Not at all surprising that the subjects of his book who are not flatteringly portrayed. I don't know how you would flatteringly portray them, but
Right.
you know,
But he makes no attempt to.
he makes no attempt to. He
Mhm.
routinely reveals what they're up to, how violent it is, and it destroys their narrative that they are responding to federal fascism or whatever. But they don't want that book sold at Powell's Books in downtown Portland. Shocking. I'm terribly surprised that they are against the publication and sale of this book.
Right.
What is shocking is that Powell's has responded to this with something other than a vigorous defense of free speech.
Yeah. So they have a long thing online, Powell's does, in response. But the first paragraph, and you can show my screen if you want. Zach, Powell's commitment to free speech. Dear Powell's community, at Powell's, a lot of our inventory is hand-selected and hand-promoted, and a lot of our inventory is not. Unmasked by Andy No came to us via one of our long-term and respected publishers, Hachette Book Group. We list the majority of their catalog on Powells.com automatically, as do many other independent and larger retailers. We have a similar arrangement with other publishers. I'll just go one more paragraph here. Since Sunday, Powell's has received hundreds of emails, calls, and social media comments calling for us to remove Unmasked from Powells.com. Due to protests outside our Burnside location, that's an auxiliary location, we have chosen to close our store, including curbside pickup, to keep our employees and customers safe. We are monitoring the situation daily, and we will reopen when it is safe to do so. Our other locations and website remain open. So it goes on, and it's all this very, very backpedaling, soft, like mealy mouth kind of defense of free speech. And the first day I went down to Powell's, the main one downtown, Pearl District, they were closed, and I was shocked. I was interested to see what it was going to look like there, and presumably because it was closed, there was nothing going on at all, except I was standing there reading the sign on their door. When a couple of other women came up behind me and murmured, "Oh, I wanted to go in. I wish it were open," this seeming not to know why they were closed, because there was nothing on the sign outside the door that explained we're closed because a mob came and tried to censor us. This is about one of the world's, I think, biggest independent booksellers responding to cries to not sell a book.
Right. And their defense is, we didn't pick it. It's in the catalog. We sell lots of things from catalogs.
And we're never going to have hard copies in the store. Don't worry about that.
Right. And
we were like, people can still order it online from us if they need to. We wouldn't, but if they need to.
Right.
But certainly you don't want it, you can't buy it in the store.
And we will reopen when it's safe, effectively giving Antifa control over when Powell's is open and when not.
Well, they were open then a few days ago. And nothing was happening.
Right, but my point is to even say that.
Yes.
It reveals the failure of the full stack here, because what's really going on, yes, Powell should make a full-throated defense of free speech, and it should say, books are about ideas. We do not vet them in advance. You are more than welcome to purchase a copy of the book, disagree with it in whatever way you wish, and you have numerous freedoms that would allow you to write a vigorous response, which we would also carry, blah, 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 blah. Right? They could do a lot of things. What's really happened here is the mayor, who said one heartening thing about enforcing the law after the election, and then basically things have gone back to the way they were beforehand with the kid gloves and all. But because we are not enforcing the law, and because a violent group is allowed to attack a bookstore so that it does not carry a book by a journalist who is exposing that very group, right? This is the collapse of civil society. This is not only you don't necessarily have the right to speak, but you are subject to effective violent editing by exactly those on whom you report, right? So this is the failure of freedom of the press. It is the failure of our governance structure. Yes, Powell's is a private entity, but our city government is not, and it has obligations to protect Andy, and it has obligations to protect Powell's. And if it can't do it here, right? If the
If,
city
if it
government,
can't do it for Powell's, then Portland is doomed.
right?
Like,
Powell's is extremely popular with Portlanders. They are rightly proud of Powell's. This amazing,
and a destination for tourists when there were tourists.
Yeah, it is one of the shining examples
Mhm.
of a brilliant non-chain bookstore. And therefore, if Mayor Wheeler were to have the police enforce the law and protect Powell's, this is the thing that is most likely to wake people up to where we find ourselves, and it's not happening. So
It's not happening.
If not this, what?
If not this, what? Exactly. And I guess the one other thing this made me think about was the nature of episodic behavior. And, we spoke a lot during the summer and the early fall when the protests were still happening every night in Portland, and they reliably, as the sun set, became riots. And yet, some, I don't know how many of them were simply confused and how many of them were intentionally being deceptive, but some journalists would say, well, here I am at noon in some random square and I don't see any protests, so I guess this is a lie. I don't see any riots. And the idea that something has to be happening at all times everywhere in order to be happening at some time somewhere is obviously a ridiculous proposition. And if you say it that way, it's revealed, but somehow most people can't keep that very simple fact in their head for very long. So, were those protests mostly peaceful? Well, actually in Portland, every single night they went from peaceful to not peaceful. Every single night, like clockwork. It was actually more like sun work, because as the time of the sunset changes, so did the time of the onset of the riots. It was regular, it was predictable, and all you had to do was be in the quote-unquote right place at the quote-unquote right time to see what was going on. And if you didn't go there at that time in those places, then you wouldn't see it. And of course, there were actually 3 or 4 or 5 regular locations that the violence was happening. Mostly peaceful. Well, by some metrics, I guess, if you want to do the math that way, but that's not journalism, is it? And, this is totally irrelevant, but I was reminded actually of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, of Douglas Adams' fabulous 5-book trilogy. With regard to the double entry that Earth gets on the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So if memory serves, it's been a while. Ford Prefect, who's actually an alien, but has picked the, he thinks, unassuming name Ford Prefect with which to live on Earth for, it turns out, decades, because he misses his ride, right? So he's stuck there and he befriends Arthur Dent. And the two of them manage to hitch a ride on a Vogon spaceship, I think, within minutes of Earth's destruction. And the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is then both the book that Ford Prefect is writing for, but also
it's an
encyclopedic reflection of all of, if you're hitchhiking around the galaxy, where might you go and what might you do in order to find
drink,
food, and might you suck on your towel to get nutrients, all of this. When he was sent to Earth to update the entry for Earth read harmless. And through dint of decades of work, he managed to double the length of the entry to mostly harmless. And I think mostly harmless accurately describes Earth about as well as mostly peaceful describes the protests and riots that have been happening in the U.S. since the end of May.
Yes, I agree with you now that you say it. Douglas Adams seems to have anticipated this foolish moment.
Yeah.
I'm sorry he's not here to see it.
Oh, I am. I am too.